Good morning. Well, welcome everybody. I hope you all feel well rested this morning. And those of you who travel from India and China, I hope you're getting over your jet lags. This is our fourth interdisciplinary Emerging Scholars Annual Symposium. And by emerging, I know, which we all are, and especially at the new school, we believe that learning is a lifelong process. Here we mean scholars who are in their early stages of long and productive scholarly career. Each year we have 3 symposiums, one each in India, China, and the final one with select scholars in New York. I think in addition to welcoming you all to the new school, I want to take a few minutes to briefly talk about the idea of the emerging scholar and put them in a broader context, tell you a bit about the format of today's symposium, a few things about logistics. I want to thank my team, and then invite my colleague and boss, Bryna Sanger, to also say a few welcome remarks on behalf of the university. Well, ICI, from its very beginning, 10 years ago, believe it or not, this is 10th year celebration for us, has aimed to engage with young scholars, both recognizing their importance in shaping important discourse, debates, and policy questions for now and also for the future. Our engagement has not only been to support and work with young scholars, but also to learn from you. Through the Star Foundation funded summer travel, research grants to new school students, supporting postdocs, inviting faculty members from India, China as visiting scholars. And through this Emerging Scholars Program, India-China Institute remains committed to engaging with scholars from India, China, as well as from the new school. It's really also part of our commitment to building a new community of scholars who are engaged in research, teaching, and policy questions related to India-China, both from historical as well as contemporary perspectives. This particular symposium is designed as a platform for emerging scholars to share their work for critical and constructive review. We have very talented and promising 5 young scholars from India and China, and 2 scholars from the new school. Each participant will present their paper for no more than 15 minutes, followed by comments from each discussant for 3 to 5 minutes. I request that all of you stick to the time limit. We have a very able, he looks very, very gentle and kind, but he can be very tough timekeeper. Storm, can you? So he'll be there. Please do, pay attention to him and follow his advice. At the end of the session, based on the time left, the chairs, a very good friend of mine, Jianying, who really is in some ways one of the people I call partner in this interesting journey of establishing India-China Institute. She was ICI representative in China. She will be chairing the first session, and the second session will be chaired by my colleague and ICI academic director, Mark Fraser, who's sitting right there. I think we have built in plenty of time to have feedback from all of you. This year we have also decided to really request each one of you, the young scholars, to also read one paper, and then comment on them. Thanks to all of you for sending your comments in advance, which we will also circulate to the concerned person. I hope the next 3 days, because the next 2 days are really, we have 2 days of interesting and very stimulating, I hope it will be very stimulating conference on new urban forms, new fields of inquiry, China and India. Many very, very well-known and interesting scholars will be presenting their work. And we have asked you to stay for 2 additional days, partly to really continue to talk to each other, but also to really engage with questions related to urbanization in India, China, which I'm sure, irrespective of what your discipline is, you encounter that on both on everyday basis as well as your scholarly work. ICI has been growing as an important hub for research, teaching, exchanges related to India, China. We have recently upgraded our website, so please do check back with it to stay connected and also updated about our work. And do send us any interesting advice or suggestions that we should really look at in order to really create our website as a resource for anyone, doesn't matter where they are located in the world, to really see this as a resource for their own work. Now let me say briefly about the logistics. I hope, especially those who are coming from outside the city, I hope you all have your hotel arrangements and your travel arrangements are all okay. In the event you need help, we have ICI team here. Grace is right sitting at the back. She's the office manager. She can solve pretty much any problem that you might have. And we have a number of research assistants and associates who are around. Please, work with them to take care of anything or any assistance you might need. One very minor correction in the agenda, the last session today, the roundtable discussion, there's an error. I think what we will do is the second session ends at 4:15. We'll take 15 minutes break, and then we'll start the final session at 4:30, and then we will go up to we'll take about hour and a half, basically. Go up to 6 o'clock. Okay, now I want to take a few minutes to really thank many people who make this possible. Many of you know what it takes to organize even a small conversation, and this conversation, because it's a year-long process, a lot of people have been part of helping us convene this symposium. Special thanks to my team, Grace Ho, Spencer Feingold, who is outside, Manling, Tim, Madhav, Ravi, Chris. They all really have been working very hard on various details. So I want to just thank them for their hard work. I also want to advance thanks to discussants for agreeing to read the papers. I know we added extra paper for some of you at the last minute, but I know that I was very happy when you responded positively. So thanks again for helping out. Lastly, I would like to invite again my colleague Mary Bryna Sanger. She is the Deputy Provost, Vice President, and she really, Bryna, thanks for all your support, all your advice, and thanks for taking the time this morning to really say a few words on behalf of the university. Thank you.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here this morning and to welcome you on behalf of the university. My work is really to try to provide support for what IC does. The India-China Institute is a collaborative project of the new school, and it's committed to engaging scholars and faculty as well as students across disciplines and academic units of the new school. And I'm very grateful to Ashok and to Mark for their extraordinary stewardship of IC, of which today's event is only one small example. IC's location in the Provost's office really reflects its importance across the university as a vehicle to bring together and engage the strengths of what really is a unique institution in the study and advancement of the India-China interactions and comparisons. And the scholars who will present their work today, you, are really central to our creating an international hub of researchers and scholarship that advances our mission, and we're really grateful to have you here. The Emerging Scholars for us is a unique initiative designed by IC to provide this great platform. We hope that you will feel, as we do, the tremendous value of this, both in bringing people with advanced degrees from professional fields as diverse as law, design, architecture, and so forth. For a decade now, IC has provided a space for the establishment and for the strengthening of scholarly networks for emerging scholars who wish to share and explore the opportunities for advancing individual and collaborative research. And I hope today you will find useful in that effort. The Emerging Scholars Program also draws on the New School's tradition of fostering horizontal and vertical knowledge sharing across the disciplines and among scholars in different stages in their career. And this is really part of the New School's placing increasing importance in contemporary problem solving to reach across the disciplines. So it's very much at the heart of what the New School is committed to. As you can see from the schedule, the Emerging Scholars work is on a wide variety of themes, and it's approaching the relationship between India and China from this multidisciplinary perspective. For this session, we have scholars who are presenting on topics as varied as Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, the economic corridor on the one hand, and the revival of Sufi shrines on the other. The diversity of themes represents IC's recognition of the importance of transcending conventional narratives of the two countries. I think we're in for a very stimulating few days, and I'm just delighted to be here with you and to wish you well. Thanks for coming to the New School.
Okay, now I think what we would like to do is really hand over the chairing of the first session to Jianying. Jianying, as I said, really is a someone that who knows India-China Institute's work from its very inception. She's a well-known writer on China, but also has taken great interest in India's story. So I'm really glad that Jianying could is available, and usually she travels quite a bit and is here. So it's yours.
Okay, thank you, Ashok.
Maybe I'll ask Marina and Amen to come here now.
Yeah.
Can you bring your thing?
She's going first, or no? She's on the first session. I'm still going by this.
Yeah, you go by that.
Yeah.
I'll just get young scholars to that.
Okay. Well, I'm really happy to be here because for various reasons I wasn't able to attend the previous. Huh? Hopefully everybody can hear me. Okay. Hello. Is this better? Is this okay? Okay. Well, I wasn't able to be involved in the earlier parts of this year's Emerging Scholars Symposium, so I'm glad to be here. And as I was looking at the session's papers yesterday, I had the same impression as she was just saying earlier, that this was such a diversity of topics and seemingly like a very chaotic jungle of topics. But then as I read through, it was really a lot of energy, very fascinating, and that made me look forward to learn and to hear and to discuss these papers, and also reminded me how this particular project has become one of my favorite EC projects. Even though I was, as Ashok knew, was one of the first, at first very skeptic about it, because I think this was 5 years ago when Ashok first raised the idea, and I really thought about only the limited funds, the limited outreaching power we had, but then from the very first year, I think I was really won over, because it has proven to be one of those small and I think beautiful things that with a very clear purpose and intellectual benefits, because we are providing, I think, very necessary and important platform for young scholars in their earlier career, where even I'm more familiar with the China part, huge internet community and lots of conferences, but for young scholars in this particular field to be able to really physically gather together and comment on each other's works and get feedback from senior scholars, I think it doesn't happen that often. So I think it's very satisfying to be able to be involved in this particular project. And I was also thinking about, in the first few rounds, we'll be sending these bilingual flyers, and the emerging scholars was translated into Chinese as something like, I think we were talking about whether to do it in as 新生代 or or 新兴学者. There's nothing quite as vivid as emerging, because 新生 means, I get the chuckles here from the Chinese part. It means either the newborn generation or the 新兴, it's like the emerging market, the newly prosperous. But nothing really captures the word emerging, which has a motion of emerging from something, and maybe from the darkness or from the water, from, I don't know, into vision, right, into air. So I think it's really good that here at that particular moment, comes EC with a platform, with hopefully a springboard into something much better. So anyway, and then I'm also happy to see that this, after a few years, we do have people who continue to come back to us, including young. Today I was very happy to see, for example, Yuan Zhang or Zhang Yuan, she was in our earlier, I think it was the last year, or the previous year, 2 years ago in Yunnan. She was one of the presenters, and she's back with us, and I could see that her career was developing. And I have to mention this, that just 10 minutes ago I discovered, her father was the editor of my first book of fiction 20 years ago, So, I mean, there are these very strange connections and that bring us back together. Anyway, so this was mainly a self-congratulatory speech about this project. So let's move on, and I want to just say the format.
Before the format, can I just interrupt one quick thing? I'm very sorry that I forgot to mention that Nimi, to thank Nimi and Sanjay. Nimi was another colleague who really was, from the very beginning, helped conceptualize this idea of this emerging scholar initiative. In fact, she and I are collaborating with Marina, to really put together an edited volume. So, and Nimi is really, she's also the ICI representative in India, someone, who, she was a fellow of the Institute. So I really want to thank Nimi for all your, great ideas and great work, both in India as well as here. And thanks to Sanjay Chaturvedi, former ICI fellow, who really, was also the key person this year in hosting the symposium in India. So just wanted to mention that, and then there are others. So, sorry,
Partha.
Oh, no, then there are other. Partha is here. Partha is an ICI fellow. He's a visiting fellow. You'll hear. Yeah. Sorry.
I have nothing to do with conceptualizing this except enjoying the outcome.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I just realized that.
Okay. So I'm just going to quickly say today's format is that each presenters will have 15 minutes to present his or her paper. We won't break for comments. We'll just have all the 4 papers first. Then afterwards, we have the commentators. Each comments should be around maximum 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes because of time. So we want to have enough time for discussion later. Okay, and since in the brochure, everybody's bios is already there. So to save time, I'm just not going to go into that. And let's start with the first paper by Yang Lu. He's a lecturer of, lecturer in the Heidelberg University, and the topic is ontological security and Indian-China relations from border war to news war. Please.
So, my name is Yang Lu, and I'm very happy to be here to share my ideas with you. And thank you very much for the whole ICI teams, to the excellent organizational effort to bring all of us here. And today, my topic is about Indian-China border dispute. This is one of the most tricky issues in Indian-China relations, and constantly the sources of agitations. So after the 1960, so we know that India-China had a war in 1962, and after that, after 20 years of diplomatic silence, and they came back to the negotiation tables. And since the 1990s, generally speaking, that peace has been maintained in the border area. However, so the sources of the conflict hasn't been resolved, and it could transform to another form. And here today I will talk about conflict that recently emerged between India and China in their media, and it's mainly focused in 2009, the period in 2009. And I also try to think about what I can explain, my puzzle, how to explain this kind of puzzle. And I find the concept ontological security in international relations is quite useful. And I will try to apply this concept to explain and also discuss the implications of this concept to the resolution of Indian border disputes in future. My presentation have 4 main parts. First part is introduction of the concept, and second part I will give an overview of the development of border dispute, and third part examine this news world in 2009 and bring the concept into analysis. And at the end, I will discuss the implication. So first starts to explain the concept. It's a concept which has roots in psychology and sociology. It's describe the psychological foundations of an individual. And this concept was first brought by Jaffer to the international relations literature, and it was further developed by other scholars such as Max Winnie, Jennifer Meaton. Ontological security means that the cognitive security and security of cognitive certainty and security of the self, and the uncertainty in its in cognition will of course cause insecurity. And the theoretical framework of these papers is mainly based on Jennifer Meaton's approach to ontological security, and he applied this concept into the slave level. And she argued that actors achieve ontological security by routinizing their relations with significant others. And these routings sustain continued agency, and therefore actors can become attached to this these relations. And in the classical international relations literature, and threat and conflicts are usually explained by the uncertainty in the international systems and threat. So her approach provides a new perspective, and that argues that it's not only that threat and uncertainty that can that can cause conflicts, but the certainty in a relationship can also cause conflict. And this is the way that the conflicts can be persistent. My core research questions is twofold. First, to what extent is the border disputes constitutive of India and China's identities in their interactions? And the second level, to what extent can the concept shed light on understanding Indian-China relations and on the resolution of the protracted border dispute? First, just look at this map. It's given overview of disputed Indian-China border areas. It is this border disputes is a legacy of the colonial period, and throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the British India expanded, and at the Himalaya it met China. And the British tried to settle the boundaries with China, but it achieved only partially. When they left in 1947, still some areas remained undefined. And you can see that here we have different sectors. The main sectors is in the eastern sectors and the western sectors. The eastern sector is the south of Mekong Mountain Line, which is currently Indian states Arunachal Pradesh, and the eastern sector, it's Aksai Chin, which is currently in Chinese Xinjiang. And Indian and China, when these conflicts, it has already a long, a long history. Behind it, and Indian and China in the 1950s, the two new republics had good relations with each other, but the conflicting border camps become the problems, and their relations soon deteriorated. In the 1962, China declared war with India, and after remarkable advance, China declared a ceasefire unilaterally, and the war ended with India's defeat. Actually, the war did not change the actual control of the Indian-China border. That is, China in the western parts and India in the eastern part. However, the war has a very big consequences on the relations and on the security situations in South Asia. India started to build its military, and India reacted with strong patriotism, nationalism, and it has far more consequences in India rather than in China. And China was described in India as betrayer of neighbor-friendly policies towards China. And after the war, the negotiations started in 1981. Here we can see that the main agreements that both sides had reached, the most two important two agreements that make the borders, generally the peace situations in borders, the two agreements in 1993 and 1996. And since the limit of time, I will not go into details of these agreements. I will continue to just describe this whole process. And if we think about a conflict, so a conflict, it has its lifetime. It has different stages. And first we have the source of conflict, and then it comes to crisis and escalate to war, and then it just come down rarely, it comes to the ceasefire stage, and negotiation. Currently, India and China are in this stage of negotiation. However, the sources, the conflict sources is there. And it emerged to a conflicts, non-physical conflicts, which I referred it to the conflict between the two medias in 2009. I think this is very interesting phenomenon, and I just want to explain the first context. So since the 2000s, India and China the relations has been intensified, and because the words, these are described as emerging powers in the world, or rising powers, and it attracted a lot of attentions of the world. And hence the reports of each other is also very attractive in their respective media. However, the image presented are often biased. And China's was mainly focused on the Indian-Pakistan conflict, nuclear conflict, and religious things, religious conflict. And the Indian side, by many observers said that in the beginning of 2000s, the media reports, the keynotes were still positive. However, there's a turn, though not without doubts and fear. However, it witnessed a turn in 2006. Many observers commented maybe because of Chinese ambassador Sun Yushi's comments in India that Arunachal Pradesh is in Chinese territory. And then since then, there's reports on border incursions increased in India. The fact in the border is there is no actually demarcated actual control line of actual control. And this is why border incursions occurs at time. And the border incursions increased in India and reached a peak in summer 2009, and the role of 24 hours 24 hours channels just really make image like it's really like war hysteria, and create an image that a second border war will soon comes in a couple of months between India and China. So this, of course, seriously affected Indian-China relations, and this kind of media hype also attracted attentions of journalists, of politicians, and so on. So in Chinese media, in this period, there's a tit-for-tat strategy, and I just picked one of the main Chinese newspaper, International Herald, which focus on international news. And during this period, you can see the titles and this tit-for-tat strategy. Now you see that these negative routines, it's already being constructed since the 1962. And here we just think about the concept of identity. Identity is always refers to a relationship, self and between the others. So just take an example. If a teacher needs its students to so that he can perceive himself as a teacher, and this is in India. In India case, in the 1962 war, India perceived its self as a victim, and for the victim, it needs a counterpart. That this counterpart is a perpetrator. It is China, and likewise, China in 1962 is a winner, and it needs its counterpart to sustain this identity as winner, that this counterpart is China. So here, this victim-perpetrator relations and loser-winner relationships is very important. And you see that in the reactions of the medias, and India gets her psychologically has an inferior position, and Chinese get a superior position, and reflected in the media that Chinese tends to look down India, and India tends to look down to look China as a threat. So, and this have the impacts on their public relations. Here, this this I will not go through, but you see that the public opinion of both sides it's not very good since then. And there's track 2 and track 1 level, and Indian-China mediation workshop organized by the National University of Singapore, try to address issues. And then you see later the Global Times Foundation and Indian Observer Research Foundations also try to address issues, and then come to the governmental level. So now I come to the, my conclusion. Excuse me, give me 1 moment. And so you see that ontological security is useful tool, and the problem is the problem here is that you see the traumatic encounters between the states, such as wars and other disruptive events, and result in the strong attachment of states to harmful routines. So, and it is difficult for them to get out of these routines, because these routines sustain their identities. And these, India and China, we see that the trend is intensified relations, but it doesn't mean that intensified relations will automatically lead to a better mutual trust. And this is the main problem between India and China. So just take an example of Japan and China. China and Japan's relations has been deepening through their economic ties, trade, tourism, and culture, but yeah, in terms of historical reconciliation and in terms of the border territorial disputes between China and Japan, we still haven't found a solution. So here I pointed out the importance of historical reconciliations on the border dispute should be paralleled with India-China intensified relations. And here we can get some insight from Europe and see how the historical reconciliation in Europe happens. For example, the post-war German reconciliation process, the participants is not only the government, but also journalists, historians, and lots of NGOs. And you see that Germany and France, they try to integrate, build a European community and to integrate their economy, and up to to try to build a political institution in EU. So here I suggest that multi-layered process, it requires initiatives from the civil society to build transnational networks, connecting these practitioners and academics. As, this is very important. And to end with, I say that to end the conflict is difficult. However, this concept do open perspective that brings new ideas in to resolve the conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the next paper is by Jingfeng Li, assistant researcher from the Sichuan Academy of Social Sciences, on the topic of driving force and constraints behind BCIM economic order.
Good morning, everyone. And my presentation was about multi-government's perspective on driving force and challenges in BCIM economic corridor. And firstly, let's talk about the origin. Origin from 2013 May, and Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang visited India and talked about this topic. And I think I wanted to put BCIM in Belt and Road because last 2 weeks before I attending a meeting in Xi'an, China, and that's about BCI. About Belt and Road. And recently there was a vision and action on joint building Belt and Road. It's said about this. So from this words, we can see that BCIM was one part of the Belt and Road. Belt and Road was China's strategic, so it's part of it. That's I think firstly we should take a definition about the economic corridor. That's my point, and no other persons or scholars talk it. Firstly, I think from the corridor, it means the road can connect 2 points. Economic corridor was connected to 2 cities. So in my opinion, economic corridor was connected Kunming and Indian Kolkata, that road. It's not include east of China, north of China, other places of China. BCIM only about Yunnan and Myanmar, Bangladesh, and the northeast of India. Secondly, next I talk about the meaning of BCIM economic. I think this is not very important for my opinions. So the second BCIM corridor is expected to drive Southeast economic development. The third was specific and regional cooperation. The fourth, it arose central and local governments in civism. About this topic, I think I make some explain. And recently, China's many provinces want to become the start point of Belt and Road. Why they want to get this start point? Because China's central government may invest monies to these provinces. So the same with the Yunnan province. Yunnan's scholars and government was very active in BCIM economic corridor because they want China's central government invest in Yunnan. I think that's for money was very important for this. Next, I wanted to talk about the driving force of BCIM economic corridor. It's very useful for China's strategic. So I said third point of this part. Next, I want to talk about Indians' consideration. Thirdly was politics, because the last Indian government, Xingge's government, he wanted to win the general election. So he needed to change the relationship with China at that point, at 2013. So it make the breakthrough at this point. Next was the economic. It's very useful for Indians' economic development because China have many foreigner invest money, about the $400 billion can invest the other countries. So if India was very active in this BCIM, so China's money may be invested in India. But in fact, next month and the Indian Modi will visit China. But I noticed it's China promised only $10 billion to invest in India. That's very small, not very large numbers. The fourth is in terms of international relations in the region. Because the Myanmar and Bangladesh was very active for BCIM economic corridor. Because they joined this economic corridor, it's where have some money China will invest to these countries. So these two countries was active. If India say no to BCIM, it will make Myanmar and Bangladesh feel Indian have selfish or self-considerations. Next, I will talk about the status quo of BCIM economic corridor. How this, it's nearly 2 years from 2013 to next month was 2 years. How it operated, I think it's no progress about BCIM economic corridor, in my opinion. Because let's, at the same time, China take up for Pakistan and China's economic corridor. It's nearly the same time because China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang visit India and then visit Pakistan and take the BCIM economic corridor and China-Pakistan economic corridor. This, from this, we can make a comparison. Now, last November last year, and China promised to Pakistan will invest Pakistan-China economic corridor was $45 billion for that project. But BCIM economic corridor, China not invest any money for this. But Yunnan province was very active for BCIM economic corridor. And the China government said was support BCIM economic corridor. But no one invest in BCIM corridor. So I think it's no progress. That's my opinion. And next, why China? Why 2 years BCIM economic corridor, no progress? I think there have many reasons. I think furtherly, Indian central government's concerns. And from now on, Indian government, central government, never said support China's Belt and Road strategy. I think it's, I understand the Indian's governments because it's the China's strategic was not very useful for Indians. And the Indian government talked about the season road and other road for contract the China's for China's Silk Road and the Sea Silk Road. So Modi's government have its self-consideration. Secondly was Sino-Indian relations problems. There were many problems, for example, and bordering problems, water problems, Pakistan problems, and many problems. So, so this will affect BCIM economic corridor. The third was failure of Indian economic policies, because this point was China's central government, the economic policy was different with its local state government's economic policy. For example, West Bangladesh's state, it's some difference with Indian's central governments. So, the fourth was Indians Bangladeshi relations. It's mainly about the immigrants, illegally immigrants. The five is northeast of India. It's there in that places that have other problems. For example, security problems, the poor economic infrastructure, and many problems for this point. Next was PGP's policy, and I think it's very clear. Modi, before he was the Prime Minister, he was in the state and make some problems in that areas. The third is Burma's politics transition and national security issues. It's very some effect about the BCIM, but not very important. Recently, and some scholars in Singapore, they asked me, what do you think Myanmar's situation about, does it will affect the BCIM economic corridor, or in the future China and India's relations? I said no, because China was very friendly from government to government, from people to people, it was very great effect on Myanmar. So no matter Myanmar's army or a democracy government is very friendly to China, and maybe in future there was a balance about China and India, but not a very great effect. That's my opinion about this point. The fourth is BCIM are mostly undeveloped regional by region. It's to pull the economy along under driving force. Because this road passed through the areas was not very developed areas. So invest money was very large, but can't earn too many monies. That's one point of constraints. So so I make my conclusion. My conclusion was about BCIM economic corridor was, I think in future, it's no progress. But China will make some effort to countries communication. For example, China will invest Myanmar. China will invest to Bangladesh. China will invest to northeast of India. It's the two countries relation, not four countries, because four countries are very difficult to coordinate for these areas. So I think BCIM economic corridor, China's government in future, it will not said more, and that's my opinion. Next study, and from April 26th, I will visit India to study my program about the rural of China and Indian compared studies. This is my presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks to the ICI team, not only for inviting me here, but also the presentation that I'm doing is based on research funded by the ICI Fellowship Program. So, and also to all of you and the commentators, especially for engaging in this with this work. So the theme of my presentation today is to try to make sense of a revival. I call it revival right now, but I will sort of complicate this as I go on in the presentation. In Sufi shrines in the Punjab region of India, which is in the northern part of the country. So let me just introduce briefly Sufi shrines for those of you who are not familiar with this religious institution. These are affiliated with Sufism, which is considered one of the Islamic schools of thought. And as you can see from this photograph, this is the largest Sufi shrine in India in terms of the numbers of people, which number in the millions every year, this shrine of Muinuddin Chishti. So some of these are very grand, large, elaborate structures built in very royal aesthetics and sort of portraying this very sort of grand kind of imagery. But there's of course also other shrines which are far more humble. Could just be a small corner of a street in some part of the city or the rural area, as this one shows, and would probably only be known to people living in that particular neighborhood or locality. So in terms of shrines in the Indian province of Punjab, the reason that this revival of shrines in Indian Punjab is paradoxical, in my opinion, is I would identify three different reasons why this phenomena, which for the last 2 decades has been growing at a very rapid pace, why this is paradoxical. So the first reason I would say is a sort of theoretical concern with the process of secularization. As most of you know, that secularization theory obviously has been debunked since the last 2 or 3 decades. for claiming that public role of religion is declining. So of course now we know that that is clearly not the case. But there are some dimensions of secularization theory, particularly the one that I'm interested in is the question of what some scholars call rationalization or differentiation. What is meant by that is that there have been attempts to define a particular religious tradition such as Islam or Sikhism or Hinduism in very clear-cut and unambiguous ways. So whether it is the practices or whether it is the belief systems, there have been attempts to sort of take out influences of other religions from a particular religious traditions to create sort of boundaries around it so it has no sort of overlapping with other kinds of religious traditions. Secondly, the other part of differentiation is also that if you identify with, let's say, Islam, if you call yourself a Muslim, then you should be restricted to pursuing Islamic practices, and you would pursuing other sacred traditions such as Hinduism or Sikhism, in the case of Punjab, would not be part of your sacred practice. So you could say a kind of a homogenization of religion. Now, this revival that I speak of militates against this, this way of resurgence of rationalization of religion, because as you can see from this photograph, you have both Islamic and Hindu iconography are both present. So that number 7 and 6 and the star and the crescent clearly identifies with Islam, whereas many of the other figures are Hindu deities and represent a completely different tradition. This is something that you find very often amongst Sufi shrines in the Punjab region of India. Similarly, if you look at the sort of physical organization of the sacred space around shrines, so on the left is a Sufi shrine, on the right is a Hindu temple, you find that the same sort of compound would have the presence of both these traditions, and sometimes even Sikh traditions would also be part of this space. So in both of these ways, you have a sort of challenge to this process of differentiation, where religious traditions coexist in the same space, and you have also, of course, people of one religious identity identifying with one religion, also practicing other religious traditions as well. The second way in which this Indian case is unexpected is that there is very little actually Muslim presence in this revival. So you have a revival of an Islamic form without essentially Muslims, because in the history of Indian Punjab, there was a partition of the province when the colonization, formal colonization ended in India in 1947. And in this partition, there was a mass migration of people based on their religious identities. So while Pakistani Punjab was the Muslim Punjab with almost more than 97% Muslim population, in the Indian Punjab, there was only 1.5% Muslims in 2001. So this revival is not because of Muslim leadership or Muslim presence, but actually despite it. And of course, the other part of the partition is that it was a very violent process with something like 10 to 12 million people moving from one place to another, accompanied as it was by massive violence, and violence that was based along communal lines. So immediately following partition, you have a sense in which there is a you could just emerge from a conflict between peoples of different religious communities. So for non-Muslims in India to now turn to Islam, some 50 years after partition, again seems paradoxical. Why turn back to a religion which had in a way been sort of separated from the body public? So how is it that we try to make sense of this revival, despite these paradoxical elements? First, I'll offer 3 different explanations that I've gotten from scholarly sources, but also from interviews with journalists based in Punjab. The first is an explanation by Anand Vivek Taneja, an anthropologist who, in his thesis on the increasing popularity of Islamic saintly and supernatural figures in Delhi, he argues that the reason that there is an increasing turn towards Islam amongst both Muslims and non-Muslims in Delhi is because Islam represents a particular form of pre-modern sovereignty. And people who are turning towards these saintly Islamic figures are seeking to sort of seek an alternative to current forms of sovereignty. So it is a sort of a turn against the modern state and capitalism, and try to seek sort of justice and try to seek an ethical selfhood through engaging with a tradition which is imagined through history to represent all sort of manners of ethics and justice and so forth. So that's Taneja's thesis, which is of course you could say applicable to not just Punjab, but it's actually he's looking at it in Delhi, but could be applicable to other parts of the country as well. And then another argument that is offered by Desraj Kali, he's a journalist based in Jalandhar city, a city in Indian Punjab. And his argument is that the revival of shrines is a reaction to neoliberal economics. What he argues is that the uncertainties of the privatized market and the sort of withering away of a stable state-guided economy has created a sort of a massive and collective sort of feeling of uncertainty. And what the response to this uncertainty has been is to turn actually towards mysterious forms of religion. So he mentions Sufism, but he also mentions Shani mandirs, which I'm not at all familiar with. But he says that both of these forms of religion, what they have in common is that even though they are very widespread, there is an element of the unknown about them. And his argument is that because of the uncertainty, because of not being able to find answers to their uncertainty, they're looking for these answers in sort of very mysterious and sort of very supernatural based forms of religion. So Sufism here, because of the rupture that it experienced after partition, has been always present around us, around the Indians in Punjab, but it took on a very mysterious form because there was a loss of the Muslim community. So you have ruins of shrines, for example, back in the 1980s and 90s, but you have really no sense of what is the history of these spaces, what is going on here, and so on. So that's his argument. The final argument by Daljit Ami, a journalist in Chandigarh, is very specific to the Punjab. And for him, this turn to shrines is part of a conversation, a sort of emerging conversation with partition itself. So he feels that Indian Punjab is at this moment in its history where it has suffered communal violence on two occasions. One was, of course, 1947 in the partition, but again in the 1980s with the Sikh pogroms and so forth, again based on communal lines. And there is now a sense that because of also economic prosperity, that there is now a moment where we actually have to now sort of face partition. Why is it that this sort of violence keeps visiting this part of the region again and again? So the turn towards Sufism is, in a way, an attempt to reconcile with partition and to reconcile with its sort of missing, Muslim past of that particular region. Now, what I'm going to do to build on these arguments, because I think they actually complement each other, they're not really necessarily opposed to each other, is to actually look at what form this revival has taken. And what I'm doing is to identify three different forms, because I'm not convinced that all of these shrines that have sort of come about and they've been revived in the last 3 decades are of the same form. So I'm looking at 3 different ways in which this revival is taking place by looking at, you can say, 3 different types of shrines that have emerged over the last 2 decades. And what I'm arguing is that the shrine is in sort of an available space for marginalized and also upwardly mobile groups and individuals to participate in and influence public life. So it is because of the sort of legitimacy that has become attached to it, it is a site for accessing power and negotiating rapidly changing world. So the first kind of shrine is, you could say, a historical Sufi shrine. Here is one of them. Here's another photograph of them. Now these shrines, some of them being 700, 800 years old, the way they have revived is that they have stressed their linkages with Islam. So these shrines have not actually taken on these sort of multiple religious forms, but have actually stressed their relationship to Islam. And you can see that one of the ways they have done so is to trace their connections to other Sufi saints in other parts of the world, in India and so forth. And this is a sort of a link, a map which shows that linkages. Another way is, if you look at the caretaker of one of these shrines, he is Muslim, and he actually clearly projects a Muslim image, as an Islamic scholar and so forth. So these shrines have become centers of migrant Muslim communities as well, but they have also become sites of conversion to Islam. So these are sort of the most overtly Islamic form of shrine, but of course also attracting non-Muslims as well. Now the second form is what I would call shrines associated with the Dalit traditions. Now what the Dalits have argued, who have been involved in Sufi traditions, is that there is a historical linkage between Dalit saints, such as Sant Ravidas, and Muslim Sufis. So they claim that Ravidas passed on his spiritual powers onto Muslim saints, and now we are actually going towards the Muslim saints to, in a way, recover our linkages with our own saints as well. So they connect. If you see the iconography, you can't see it very clearly. It has a combination both of Dalit, both spiritual leaders, but also political leaders. So you even see a photograph of Ambedkar talking to the Sufi saint here in this picture. So this is a very clearly identified Dalit space, and you could say a sort of a way for Dalits to, you could say, imbibe a particular kind of Sufi sensibility, combining with their own particular construction of their history. Finally, this shrine is what I would call a shrine of spectacle, or a mega shrine, which is actually very different from the other two forms, because this shrine is very much based around a sort of celebrity, holy person sort of phenomena. So the Godman phenomena, which you find all over India, is probably very helpful in explaining these forms of shrines. And in these shrines, you have, again, a very neoliberal kind of sensibility. If you look at one of the sort of leaders of one of these shrines, he's holding a wad of cash. And you see many different images like this of such leaders who their sort of projection of power is based around their generosity, their ability to bless their followers with wealth. So again and again, you hear the same narrative of how becoming a devotee of this shrine has enabled people to become wealthy and to sort of improve their businesses and so on. But these shrines are very ambiguously linked with Sufism. You see very little, actually. Again, this is a very sort of celebrity style. This is one of, again, the same saint. But he's posing as sort of a rock star more than he is as a godman. And again, eccentric figures such as Maiya Bhagwan. This is the shrine of Maiya Bhagwan, and he sort of dresses as a woman, and then sort of his power is again sort of linked to his eccentricity and linked to his ability to sort of transcend, moral sort of restrictions and so on. Okay, so since I'm out of almost, do I have 1 minute yet, or?
You're out of time.
I'm out of time. Okay, I'm just going to conclude very quickly that in terms of the typology, the brief survey of these different shrine forms serve to complicate any straightforward reading of this revival. I think it's a sort of confluence of different kinds of factors that are leading to this particular revival. And the factors, to summarize, is sort of migration of Muslims, Dalit conversion to Islam, and emergence of Islam in terms of partition reckoning, and then also dealing with the kinds of neoliberal transformations in society, And finally, that it is also not a coincidence that these various actors have selected the Sufi tradition for their revival, because what I would argue is that it shows the sort of inherent fluidity and flexibility of the shrine form, that it is able to sort of deal with an array of traditions and rationalities into its fold. And the kinds of desires that are being thrown up by neoliberal India are also being absorbed by this sort of historic religious form in that region. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to present my work today. And just like Amen, I want to thank the ICI Institute for allowing me to not only present, but also to conduct research on China. And I have to say that much of what I'm presenting today was sort of prompted by my trip to China last year, where I was trying to find out information on the 1905 anti-American boycott. And that information was pretty much missing, but as I will show you, there was a lot of information on the Opium War and the treaties that China had to enter into in the 19th century. So that prompted me to revisit my history knowledge of the treaties and actually to reread some of the treaties themselves. So without further ado, what I'm presenting here today is a very small portion of a much larger project where I study the autonomy of migration, and I will say a little bit more of what I mean by that towards the end of the presentation. Some definitions that I want to give you, just so that it's clear. When I talk about migrants, I don't necessarily talk about migrants within the context of a class, meaning I don't see migrants as only people who are poor or only people who travel from the south to the north. Migrants for me are persons, or I emphasize in migration the process of circularity and movement rather than the process of settlement. So what I'm presenting today, and sort of the basic argument here, is that the 19th century capital expansion provided migrants with language and strategies to claim rights. And I have included a picture here that sort of speaks to that argument. As you see, that's Uncle Sam, who, unlike everybody else who holds a sword and tries to carve out a piece of China, Uncle Sam is holding a treaty. Because the idea, and there is a lot of scholarship on that, is that the United States saw its process of capital expansion in the Pacific not through necessarily military means, but through negotiation of treaties. So they were not waging their sword as much as all the other powers in the region. And somehow something is missing. Oh, okay. So how am I going to develop this argument and what exactly it means? I'm basically stating that in the 19th century, capital expansion was conditioned on rights to territorial access and guarantees for protection. And these treaty agreements essentially extended reciprocal rights and guarantees not only to foreign nationals in China, but also to Chinese traveling or residing in other locations. And here also we can talk about this sort of very neat distinction where when, let's say, Chinese or people from the South travel into the developed world, they're called immigrants or migrants, whereas when the privileged North goes to the South, they're called expats. Right? They're not called migrants and immigrants, which is another interesting theme to explore. So what exactly actually happened and how did it help migrants to leverage their position? I will argue that there was a subversion of the language of the international treaties. and basically disruption of the flow of capital and capital expansion that happened as a result of restrictions to migration, particularly of the Chinese migrants. And there were also disruptions of trade networks and boycotts of foreign goods. Because I have very limited time, I will not provide you with too much of the historical data, but I will be happy to address that more in the Q&A session. So ultimately, migrants' claim to rights both followed and utilized the logic of capital expansion, particularly the push to access and develop consumer markets. So when I talk about capital expansion here, I talk about not only access to territories, but also development of consumer markets. And this is essentially what migrants utilized in their ability to leverage their rights. So how did it happen exactly? As I will develop here in this presentation is that in the 19th century, the treaties that were developed were particularly conditioned on rights to territorial access and guarantees for protection. And as I said previously, the treaty agreements provided such guarantees not only to foreign nationals in China, but to Chinese traveling abroad. Okay, so what were the capital requirements? I present this more in my paper, but just to briefly summarize, and for those of you who are familiar with the statue, which is kind of very prominent in China, it's almost neat. This is Lin Zexu, the Chinese commissioner who opposed the British and disrupted their opium trade and essentially initiated the first Opium War. This is a picture that I took in the Hong Kong Museum of Hong Kong History Museum. So what I want to talk about in terms of capital requirements and capital expansion into China during that period of time is not so much the military invasion. Yes, there was definitely military encroachment and war, but what is very interesting, particularly when you read either the treaties or the correspondence between merchants and their governments, is that the merchants wanted protection. What basically happened was that Lin Zexu threw everybody in prison, not just the Brit, or killed a lot of the merchants that would not follow his order to stop trading in opium. So basically what comes out across from a lot of these documents is that merchants needed protection. They needed some guarantee that they can stay in the territories. They needed access to territories. So capital expansion, yes, we can talk in the broader context that it's very oppressive, but on a very local level it requires access to territories and guarantees of protection, just as it would be the case for any type of migrant moving from one territory to another. What is also very important, and this is probably a distinction that allowed for migrants to use international treaties in the 19th and early 20th century, but later on was no longer available, was that companies in the 19th century and early 20th century, particularly in China, were not considered independent legal entities. So the person who was responsible for running a company was basically could not get away by saying, oh, it's the company's responsibility, it's not my personal flaw. So basically, managers, particularly foreign managers, were not exempt from wrongdoing because the corporation did something. Of course, this will change in the 20th century. Capital requirements also meant that there needed to be a way to ease the anti-foreign sentiment that existed throughout China during that period of time. I will not go into the historical details of that, but essentially, and if we even draw some parallels with the territory which is India at the time, the East India Corporation had 20,000 troops of its own to protect the employees of the East India Corporation. So capital expansion meant protection of foreigners into these territories. And of course, in order to get these capital requirements to work the way the Western companies and governments wanted, in China, the result of that was the Opium War. Here I have a picture, it's not very clear, you will not see it very well, of the signing of the Nanjing Treaty in 1842. There are only 4 Chinese in that crowded room, and yeah, you will not, again, not see it very well. What I want to draw your attention to, although it's not very clear, is that these Chinese maybe don't look necessarily happy, but they don't look very sad either in signing the accords. Of course, this is a British representation of the treaties, but what is curious to me, and this is again something that appears in the Hong Kong Museum of History, is that the British would spend the time to present the Chinese as agreeing with the accord. So there was really an intention on all sides with all treaties to sort of represent to the international community that this is not an imposition. Of course, we can talk that it was an imposition, but there was perhaps this performativity of making this look like everybody is on the same page and everybody is agreeing. So and these treaties, of course, are known in history as the unequal treaties, because basically they forced China into complying to Western demands in a rather imposing way. And the unequal treaties, not just in the context of China, but in general, the treaties that the Western countries signed with a lot of either colonial or semi-colonial territories, essentially delineated the prerogatives of the Western nation state, the sovereignty of the Western nation state, and of course affirmed the global dimensions of the European legal system. Right. At the same time, the unequal treaties, however, as I said earlier, guaranteed territorial access, rights, and protection. They expanded the possibilities for collaboration, and they affirmed the need for an international system in which all these rights and protections can be developed. I will skip this slide. Basically, you can see here I have highlighted how both treaties, the British and the United States treaties, were worded with reciprocal rights for Chinese nationals in Britain and in the United States. And because I'm running out of time, I will go straight to my point, how migration and capital expansion essentially became linked. Because the treaties facilitated this protection and guarantees, basically that meant that they facilitated migration was needed in order to facilitate capital expansion. Without protection and guarantees, there would be no capital expansion, in other words. So the reverse logic was used by the Chinese for about 70 years to basically disrupt the flow of capital anytime when they felt that if there is a challenge to migration, then they have the right to disrupt the capital flow. And again, I don't have time to go into the details of that. But perhaps the most exemplary case of disruption of the flow of capital expansion is the 1905 boycott of American goods. I have for you part of a poem that was written as part of the education campaign for consumers so that they don't buy American cigarettes. These were the cigarettes from the British American Tobacco Company. What is very crucial to understand, there is a lot of literature on the boycott, of course, none of which, to my knowledge, links it entirely with the factor of migration and the way in which migration was practically the central impetus for this boycott. What is interesting about the boycott was that it was not something that happened in the United States. It happened in throughout China and actually in a lot of territories that were outside China. Provided great consumer education to the Chinese, particularly their understanding of what American products are, and truly disrupted the American standing in the region. So in kind of a continuation of my work, I talk about the British reaction to that boycott, with basically the British telling the US, you're insane to be restricting the Chinese from migrating. Just one more minute for my conclusion. What is the significance of this work? It allows me to rethink the way in which capital and migration are linked. Usually when we talk about migration and link it to capital, we talk about labor exploitation. I'm not denying that there is labor exploitation, but I want to research other ways in which capital and migration are linked. Also, I want to take migration out of the narrow definitions of refugee studies or humanitarianism and speak to the agency of migrants to subvert the ways in which treaties and legal documents place them and codify their place. And most importantly, to speak about migration as an autonomous phenomenon that can influence social and political developments. And of course, that can be open to research outside China into other regions as well. Thank you.